quality is a lot more complex than people imagine. I'm going to give you an example of actually a completely different, a city in Mexico where I worked many years ago. This was in the 90s, so truly a long time ago. And they had approached us for help because they had limestone quarries, and literally the air was covered with limestone dust. I mean, London was actually the first place that was known for lousy air quality. So as cities grow and as you tackle one thing and something else comes along and then the pollution on that increases, you kind of have to be vigilant. And therefore I think it's so important that a system is put in place to manage it, recognizing that when you have a city, you have people, you're going to have concentrated pollution.
So our conclusion is that we need more common sense.
So in London, people will go on the bus. It doesn't matter which economic segment they're from. They'll use the bus, they'll use the tube, or they'll use the train.
Hello and welcome again to another installment of Front Seat to Climate Change. With us today is Kulsum Ahmed, who is a veteran in the field of climate and environmental management. She runs an organization called Integrated Learning Means, but for the past 35 years, she has been with the World Bank as a global practice manager and running operations in pollution management and climate mitigation. So welcome to the show, Kulsum, and very happy to have you on the show, and also having to get a chance to interact, because we generally had a lot of conversations that were pending in regards to a bunch of things. But I think our discussion today that has been on our minds since over the past couple of years, you mentioned that you wrote in Dawn back in February 2017 on clean air, and no one was really interested in that subject at that point. But 8 years down the line, clean air is not just a national agenda, it's a global agenda at this point. Wherever you go, WHO is having a conference in March. COP29 was about clean air and health. So when we talk about air quality, what are the key things we should be really considering when taking example of a city? Because cities are, hustling, bustling activity, transportation, energy, industry. What should we really be, taking the example of maybe Karachi? What can we do to improve air quality in a situation like this, in an area like this?
Well, Dawar, first it's nice to meet you in person. We've had so many chats through the computer, but it's much better in person. It's a good question you ask, because firstly, you're absolutely right. Globally, there is a lot of focus on air quality because a lot of people's health is affected. So it's important to do something from a public health dimension, which also means an economic dimension, because when people are ill, they're less productive, they can't get to work. So it affects the economy of a country. How do you go about it? Air quality is a lot more complex than people imagine. You have to start off with any city with the data first, to try and understand what are the sources of pollution. You can do that two ways. You can build models and create emissions inventories. And the second is you can actually have monitors which measure the pollution, and that it's called source apportionment, which have the ability to even tell you exactly what is causing the pollution, the breakup of that pollution into its constituent parts. So you have to first start with data. That's what I would say is the most important.
Yeah, and then data is always this point where in Pakistan we start giving up, because there's a lack of data or a lack of transparency of the data that exists. And one thing that we, when we try to even take, measurements of PM 2.5 levels, you also have this question mark that is the data that you're getting from a monitor accurate compared to the other, international standard devices. So once we have the data, for example, let's assume that we know that we have these gigagrams of, or maybe kilotons of PM 2.5 coming from this sector. What should be the ideal way? Do we start putting in money and trying to come up with interventions in it? Do we work with the public? Do we work with legislators? What could be the next steps to getting the data in place and then working broader to start mitigating the pollution as well?
Another excellent question. actually breathe. Pakistan says it exactly right. It's kind of everybody in it together. You have to, firstly, you're right, data is a problem, but data is a problem everywhere. It's not that it's just one country. People often don't look at this issue till a city grows and the pollution levels suddenly become a lot, and then people suddenly become aware of it. And what you have to do is you have to work with the people, civil society, with different institutions, academic, media, on the ground to actually first inform people of what needs to be done, and they understand the consequences, and then provide solutions. And it requires behavior change to switch from whatever you're doing, the status quo, to whatever is the new, cleaner way of things. So you kind of have to do it all together. And doing it all together, how do you bring people along? I think that's actually a pretty crucial question. In my opinion, I think the more people themselves are involved, for example, in even generating the data, like having these days, you can have personal monitors. You don't have to have the fancy, well, a lot of cities do, but you don't have to. All those will equally tell you. And when you have several thousand monitors in a city, then even if one is slightly off, as you said, quite honestly, you can get a sense in a particular area from all the others what is roughly right. And you need roughly right, because you want to be able to see that whatever you're doing, whether it has an effect or not. If it has an effect, then you can do more of it. If it doesn't have an effect, then you know that that's not really the cause of the pollution or the issue. I'm going to give you an example of actually a completely different, a city in Mexico where I worked many years ago. This was in the 90s, so truly a long time ago. And they had approached us for help because they had limestone quarries, and literally the air was covered with limestone dust. It was white. And they said, oh, can you help us? We have a real air quality problem. And actually, we worked with a lab and did some source apportionment, and pretty soon found out that actually the source of PM 2.5, which is actually what affects health, as you know, was not the limestone quarries. And that's quite amazing when you think about how much, you can imagine how much dust is generated with that. It was actually unpaved roads. And together they were having, the unpaved roads were having a way more of an effect, whereas the limestone was of a certain size that it probably got caught in the nose and didn't go all the way down to the lungs. So that's that certainly made me aware of the importance of the science, but importance of also kind of using monitoring to adjust things as needed, but bringing people along, letting people be part of that. And not everybody realizes when somebody does things with good intentions that sometimes things don't work.
And that's actually a very interesting example. There's been case over the last 2 years in Islamabad that residents of the villages at the back of Margala complained that there's a lot of dust coming from the quarrying activity over there. So there was this commission that the Islamabad High Court set up, and it ended up installing few monitors around the mine and then the fences of the mine as well. And they found out that the PM 2.5 levels actually go up in the night when the quarrying stops. It stopped. And eventually they realized that the PM 2.5 was coming from households because they were burning wood for their cooking at night and heating at night. And this is a combination of, again, having contextual knowledge about the place, monitoring, data available, and then, as you mentioned, limestone or certain rocks, they're PM10, they're not PM 2.5. So this is a very interesting, and that's when I also think about our local issues and national level. There's so many sources that you don't consider in the beginning. If you talk about, again, the case of Karachi, we have the unpaved roads that we keep on running into. So what could be areas that we so far have unexplored, maybe from examples of other developing countries, that this is something that they eventually found out and it worked and it's a good solution? And what are maybe some of the areas where we think that our initial estimates were wrong and we need to accept that and we need to move to an actual solution?
Right. Certainly, this unpaved road thing is a huge thing. I remember Shahid Javed Barki.
Yes, the economist.
Exactly. At one point in time, he was the country director for China at the World Bank, and he told me this story, talking about air quality. When initially, the very first time, they realized, that there was an air quality issue. The first thing that actually they sought to tackle was covering up the construction and trying to make sure that there was less road dust. That was like, these are, what does less road dust imply? For example, in Karachi, they've been putting in urban drainage, very important given the changing climate and so forth. And also burying the cable lines and all the rest of it, and updating the gas, all very important to prevent leakage. But each time roads have been dug up. If, for example, there had been planning that they were just dug up once and then everything put in and then covered up, that would help. Or some sort of planning effort where you kind of have a rule that you're not going to leave a road unpaved. You'll quickly do what you have to do and pave it within a certain period of time, a week, 2 weeks, rather than leaving it for several months.
They leave it for years over here.
Well, it's particularly important, at least in Karachi, in the winter time, as I'm sure you know, because 9 months of the year, the wind takes all the pollution out.
Yeah.
So even if a decision was made not to break the road up in those 3 or 4 months where the wind actually blows towards the city as opposed to out to sea, perhaps even that would have made a huge difference in terms of making sure that the loads remain low. So I think it is very contextual. You're absolutely right. And for exactly that reason, having a system in place that allows you, not just you meaning the government, meaning everybody who lives in that city, an understanding of, okay, things are going in the right direction or in the wrong direction. Maybe we should change course, something needs to be done, so that you get all the signals. I mean, London was actually the first place that was known for lousy air quality. I think they had a terrible fog. I think it was 1952. It used to get blamed on weather. Actually, Churchill famously used to blame it on weather. But actually it was pollution. And pollution from, they used to burn coal in those days everywhere, in houses, in industry, everywhere. So till they shifted out of that, and actually it took, after that one massive fog where something like, it's estimated that 12,000 people died. This was in traffic accidents and, from illnesses and so forth. They passed a Clean Air Act and they did something about it. But London today, which is a very clean London, still has a PM 2.5 problem. But today it's due to transport. So as cities grow and as you tackle one thing and something else comes along and then the pollution on that increases, you kind of have to be vigilant. And therefore, I think it's so important that a system is put in place to manage it, recognizing that when you have a city, you have people, you're going to have concentrated pollution, and you have to deal with it. It's not anybody's fault. It's just something that needs to be managed.
Yeah. I think probably at the end of our discussion as well, that one last thing that possibly, I think you've also worked on this as well, is that once you have data, once you know the problem, such as through an inventory, such as we're talking about transport or maybe coal use, each sector will have a different set of prescriptions you can give it to make it work.
Yes.
And I don't think in our country or in a lot of countries right now, people are using that approach. What they do is they just have an inventory, they know this is a big sector, and they start blaming that sector in the expectation it will automatically,
Yeah,
people will feel bad and
yeah,
stop using
which
cars.
is not fair.
Which is not fair.
Yeah.
So how do you, if you want to pick a sector, what would you
Right.
do to resolve it?
Well, there's two ways. One is using that source apportionment, figuring out which are the sectors which have a bigger contribution. So that's one. But what you find is there may be easy things to do there, but there may be difficult things to do. There may be others where you can have what they call low-hanging fruit, where you don't have to spend much and you can easily bring down PM 2.5. So think of PM 2.5 as a pool of pollution, and there are some things you can't control, like natural dust in some parts, right? You can't control that. So that's there. Now, if that's a little bit above normal, but on the other hand, you can control transport, or you can control industry that happens to be there, then you have to make sure that less emissions from those other sources go into that pool. So you have to kind of look at all of these things together, and you have to see what are the things. You have to start with the things that don't cost you much, but actually will give you some result, because that's just what makes sense. I mean, most countries are not going to just throw, either countries or people are going to throw tons of money at this. You have to start with all the things that you can do easily, like the better planning example we talked about with the road paving. That's just being more organized, right? So you start with those, and then you take it up further and further.
So our conclusion is that we need more common sense.
That's what it is, yeah.
That's
yeah.
what it is for air quality management.
I'm a scientist, by the way, not an economist, but an economist would tell you, well, you do cost-benefit analysis and you figure it out, on that basis. So you do that of all your alternatives and you look at which are the ones. But even then, I can tell you that there may be things which are low cost but high benefit, but where that kind of push to change behavior can take time. So even though they are like that, then you have to think through how can you facilitate that change. Using mass transport is an example of that, and I feel very proud of that. Actually, one of the first projects or countries I worked on was Colombia in Latin America. And in Bogota, the very first bus mass rapid transit project, the Transmilenio, it was actually the first bus mass rapid transit project in the world. I know Pakistan has some of those now, but that was the very first one in the world. We did that, and we were also doing things in terms of putting an urban environmental management system in place for waste management, regulations, for air and water quality management, and so on, because the country had suddenly become urbanized country as opposed to being a rural country, with very little urban population. And to my delight, the shift that happened of people using that bus rapid transit system of different economic groups. So in London, people will go on the bus. It doesn't matter which economic segment they're from. They'll use the bus, they'll use the tube. Or they lose the train. It's not the case everywhere. And it certainly wasn't the case in Colombia. But there was a shift. So that was like a huge thing in terms of people realizing, okay, this makes a difference. One, I get from one place to the other faster. But two, it made a huge difference from a transport emissions reduction perspective in Bogota. So I feel very proud of that, actually.
So that's, I think, brilliant to hear about. And my learning here is that, you really need to be commonsensical in your approach, follow the evidence. And for a country like ours with limited resources, it needs to be low cost and high benefit.
Yes.
And I think
and no blame game, because this happens to everybody. I mean, any city which grows, which is a normal thing, cities grow, over time, because that's where the economic activity is. People come for jobs. You're going to have this problem. So there's no point, kind of pretending it doesn't exist. It's better to just tackle it, not to put it under the carpet. So
So thanks a lot for your, I think, brilliant inputs and insights into. It's always a learning, when you start comparing our context to others. And hopefully, a lot of these learnings are also going towards policymakers. And with that, we would like to conclude. Hopefully, Pakistan has clean air one day. Breathe Pakistan is bringing you more content around the show and also the conference. Looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you.